Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is free trade versus protectionism. So we're going to be talking about the debate and the trade-offs we see between those two and how it might affect a country like Costa Rica. First, let's make sure we understand why we should have a unit on trade when we're studying a country. Well, specifically for Costa Rica, for us to understand economic development in Costa Rica, and of course also in Central America, we have to understand trade. It's really important. Costa Rica is increasingly more involved in trade now that they're part of CAFTA-DR, and that also extends to other parts of Central America. This is an area where free trade is really starting to expand. So they've established this free trade agreement, and that's going to have lots of effects, not just on Costa Rica, but on all countries that are participating in Central America. However, there are pros and cons and trade-offs that we need to talk about when we think about establishing free trade. That means there will be winners and there will be losers. So it's not a panacea. Not every single person and every single firm wins under free trade. Most economists support free trade. And this study's a little old, but it's the most recent one we have that's done this. A 2006 study determined that only 10% of economists support trade barriers. That's where we have restrictions on trade. So we're going to be talking about trade barriers. That's the opposite of free trade. 10% of economists, that's it, support having trade barriers, meaning they support the opposite of free trade. So there's overwhelming support for free trade, and if we replicated this same study now, we're going to get a similar answer. Trade is good. Economists argue that trade is good. This is something that is almost universally agreed upon. It's important for developing countries, and we've talked about that in some other units. Remember that when a country gets involved in trade, especially a developing country, it gives them access to new markets. It could be bigger markets. Imagine being able to tap into the U.S. market, a very large market with a lot of money. And it gives them access to new technologies as well. And the bottom line is that research supports that trade is good for economic development. It would be pretty hard to develop economically if you've got closed borders and you're not trading with others. We want to focus on free trade. So when we talk about trade being good, we're really saying free trade is good. And what we mean by free trade is where goods can freely flow between countries. In other words, there's an absence of those barriers that prevent the flow of goods. So free trade means that two countries can send goods and services to each other without the trade barriers that are normally in place. For example, there are not tariffs. A tariff is a tax on an import. So think about it. If two countries agree to free trade, then they are dropping their tariffs. And you can imagine that's going to have positive effects when the taxes are no longer being required upon entry of goods that are imported. NAFTA is an example of a free trade agreement, and it's probably one you've heard of and maybe you're familiar with. This is a free trade agreement that was established between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And so it's been around for quite a while. Then it was kind of disbanded in lieu of changing it to something else similar. But the idea is that we still have this kind of agreement in place. In general, economists believe that we're better off being a part of NAFTA, that there are some trade-offs, as we're going to talk about, but in whole, in net, we're better off being part of this agreement with Canada and Mexico. With NAFTA, goods and services are being exchanged at lower prices between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. They can all buy goods and services from each other without paying those tariffs or other types of trade barriers that raise prices. Well, if you're buying things for cheaper, then you can import more, right? So countries are going to be importing more from each other. But remember, if one country's importing more, that means somebody else is exporting more. So it creates a win-win. For example, Mexico can buy trucks from the United States without import taxes. So when Mexico wants to buy trucks, they can say, okay, where do we want to buy these trucks from? Should we buy them from the European Union? Or should we buy them from the United States? Well, the United States, because there's no import taxes in place. So Mexico will buy trucks from the U.S. because it's more economical. Of course, when the prices are lower, they're probably going to buy more trucks. The United States can buy clothing from Mexico, again, without these same import taxes. So when the United States is looking at importing clothing, they could import it from Asia. They can import it from Central America. Well, they might say, okay, we can get it the best deal from Mexico. Doesn't mean they're going to buy all their clothing from Mexico, but it probably means they're importing more from Mexico than they would. And that's good for the United States when they get that lower price. And of course, it's good for Mexico because Mexico is the one exporting. You get the idea. It creates a win-win. But you can see from this how this would increase trade volumes, right? When you have US, Canada, and Mexico trading with each other, it's going to create higher trade volumes, and this in turn creates jobs. So this is why we say that developing economies, and of course developed ones too, but we're really focusing on developing economies right now. You can see how developing economies would really benefit from being involved in some kind of free trade agreement like this. It's going to lead to more trade in total, and that is welfare enhancing. It's going to create jobs. Does every single person benefit under free trade? Is this a win for every single person? And the answer is unfortunately no. But look, there's a lot of things in life that not everyone benefits from, right? Every time government creates a government policy, there are winners and there are losers. Same thing in the trade game. Now, imagine if you worked for a clothing manufacturer in the United States. And remember, we've just become part of NAFTA with Mexico and Canada. Now, under NAFTA, it's going to be harder for you to compete as a clothing manufacturer in the United States. Why is that? Well, think about it. Because of Mexico. Mexico has labor costs that are lower. So once we establish free trade and you're the clothing manufacturer, okay, this could be a little challenging for you. It's going to be harder for you to compete because Mexico probably can produce clothing cheaper. Their labor costs are lower, of course, than in the United States. So if you're the clothing manufacturer, you personally don't want free trade in clothing, right? So understand that we've said free trade is good for the economy. We've never said it's good for every single person, and this is a good example. And guys, I'm from Texas. When we passed NAFTA, there were jobs that were lost. They moved to Mexico. Not every single person is a winner. You're the clothing manufacturer. You don't want free trade. Your firm goes out of business possibly. You clearly did not win. Just like those jobs that were in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas that moved to Mexico, those people did not win. But it's still good for the economy. Some industries might contract or shrink or get smaller when we have free trade because now they're seeing competition and they didn't see that level of competition before. But the thing we have to remember is that other industries grow, and that's what some people lose sight of. Yes, there will be some jobs lost, but remember other industries are growing, so there will be jobs gained. We have to remember that over time, economies evolve. They don't stay exactly like they are. For example, do you still see rotary phones? You may not even know what a rotary phone is, but when I was young, your phone was attached to the wall and it wasn't push button. It had a dial. We don't ever see those anymore. Or what about cassette players? I grew up with cassette players. They had just replaced the 8-track tapes. We don't see these anymore. Do we want to mandate that everyone use cassette players simply because we're worried about losing jobs at those factories that produced cassettes? No, that would make progress non-existent, right? But there are jobs that are lost as an economy evolves, and trade is just one of those ways that economies evolve. So progress has winners and progress has losers, no different with trade. This is related to the idea of creative destruction, and that's a great way of explaining it. Look at that term again, creative destruction. What we're saying basically is out with the old and in with the new. That's what creative destruction's all about, out with the old and in with the new. And in the transition, there will be some that lose for sure. The trade game can be very complex, and this is a good example. We have to go back to the Clinton administration, and during the Clinton administration, the president convinced Haiti to lower its trade barriers on American rice. So make sure you understand what that's saying. Before President Clinton got involved, Haiti had trade barriers on American rice. That was to keep American rice out of their country. By lowering the trade barriers, what we're saying is they're getting closer to free trade in rice. So this means that Haiti would allow in more American rice. So the president is thinking about the benefits to the American economy if we can ship a lot more rice to Haiti. But this had really bad consequences for Haiti because they no longer could compete. They also produced rice, but by letting in our rice, they could no longer compete. Why is that? Because of price. The rice from Arkansas, 6 pounds was $3.80, but the rice from Haiti, 6 pounds was $5.12. Okay, you see the problem. They're letting in the rice from Arkansas, but it's cheaper than the domestically produced rice in Haiti. Now, Haitians preferred their own rice based on everything I've read on this example. They thought it tasted better than American rice, but it's now too expensive when there's U.S. rice that's cheap. So all of a sudden, they start consuming American rice instead of their own rice. So Clinton negotiated a deal that benefited the United States. We're going to send you more rice. You're going to be buying more rice. But the problem is, as we sold more rice, that had a consequence, right? It hurt Haiti because it displaced their rice. When they couldn't compete, it created a lot of harm to Haiti's rice industry. So the bottom line is, at least for Haiti in this example, free trade made them worse off in rice. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to participate in free trade in rice. And sometimes we choose not to participate in free trade when we have industries that are big and they cannot compete. There were probably other industries where they could benefit from free trade. It just turns out that rice was not one of them, but rice is a big industry there. President Clinton has since apologized for destroying the rice industry in Haiti, but this is an example that really helps you understand the trade game is complex, that free trade can benefit an entire economy, but it might hurt certain industries. And you have to be careful. If your economy really depends on rice, then this might not work for you, and maybe you shouldn't get involved in free trade with the United States. Now, as we just said, free trade is good for the overall economy, but there are losers under free trade, and we just gave a good example with the Haiti example in rice. Again, we're talking about the creative destruction process, that economies evolve. Certain industries shrink over time, but other industries grow. Some jobs are lost, but other jobs, well, they're gained. So let's think about who the losers are under free trade. We have to think about the domestic producers who compete with the import. So let's think about the domestic producers, right? What I mean by domestic producers, it means made at home. So if you have protectionism, that's good for you as a domestic producer. You don't have as much competition. But once we implement free trade, now there's more competition. So if you're a domestic producer and you're competing with the import, and now there's more of that import, and it's coming in without the tariff, which means the price is lower, you can understand how now you're going to see more competition. As an example, let's think about Ford, which is a domestic auto producer in the United States, right? You all are familiar with Ford. Well, Ford probably does lose some sales when Hondas are imported, right? If we kept all the Hondas out of our country, Ford would probably sell more. But here's the thing, Ford also benefits when other countries are involved in free trade with us because now Ford can sell to them. But Ford just at home would rather not see Hondas coming into the country, right? So Ford would rather not have this competition that comes with free trade. Now, Again, I'm not saying that free trade is overall bad for Ford, because with free trade, Ford sells cars all over the world, right? So we want to understand that, but I'm just talking about here at home, Ford would rather not have this competition. They'd rather not have the Toyotas, the Hondas, for example, coming in, because that just means more competition for Ford. Let's move on to talk about this idea of protectionism. It's the opposite of free trade, and you've probably already gotten a sense of this, but let's talk about it more formally. Let's go back to the question of Ford. Ford doesn't want Hondas and Toyotas coming in domestically here in the United States, so that creates more competition for them. So what do they want instead? Well, what they want instead is protectionism, to be protected from competition. Right? Don't we all want to be protected from competition? If you're a restaurant that opens up in Farmville, wouldn't you love to be protected from competition, right? Every company wants to be protected from competition. That only makes them better off. So what Ford wants is to keep some of the foreign cars out. Now, how do we do that? Well, through the idea of protectionism. We're going to protect the domestic industry. That's what we mean by protectionism. Protect the domestic industry. How do we protect the domestic industry? By shielding them from some of the competition. Not necessarily all of the competition, but by shielding them from some of the competition. In other words, they see less competition. And of course, they're going to sell more that way. How do we do that? Well, we use what we call trade barriers. So you've already heard me refer to trade barriers. We're going to talk about them a little more formally. But trade barriers are going to be those things that restrict trade. There are generally two types of trade barriers, and I am keeping it simplistic because if we wanted to get complex, there are trade barriers that combine these two different kinds of things, and it gets a little more complicated, and we don't need to get that complicated. We can learn everything we need to learn by just keeping it simple. So we're going to talk about the two general categories of trade barriers. The first one we've already mentioned, and that's a tariff, and a tariff is a tax on an import. So obviously you understand that when we put a tax on an import, that import gets more expensive. But we also want to talk about a quota. A quota is a limit on the amount that can be imported. So we're going to restrict the number of units, for example, or we're going to restrict the number of tons. So a tariff, a tax on the import, quota, a limit on the amount that can be imported. So these are our two very general types of trade barriers. And as I said, sometimes we combine them into, part tariff, part quota, and it can get a little more complicated. It turns out that tariffs and quotas have the same economic effect, and that makes it easy. Both of these lead to a decrease in supply. The tariff is more indirect because the tax reduces the supply, but obviously a quota, when you limit the number of units, well, that's a direct decrease in supply. So both a tariff and a quota lead to a decrease in supply. Now, I understand that some of you haven't had supply and demand, but you don't need supply and demand to understand this. You understand this perfectly well. Think about fresh fruit in the winter, things like berries. What often happens to the price of those berries? Do you agree? They go up in price a little bit. Why? Because the supply has gone down a little bit. So I know you understand when something is lower in supply, when there's less of something, the price goes up. So that's the economic effect of both a tariff and a quota. They both lead to a decrease in supply, and that leads to increases in price. So think about what we've just done by using a tariff and a quota. The imported product now becomes more expensive. That's key. The imported product has now become more expensive. And guys, that's what we're trying to do when we implement protectionist policies using tariffs and quotas. We're trying to make that import a little more expensive. Now, we haven't necessarily banned the import from coming in. So understand, protectionism doesn't mean that you can't send any of your goods to the United States. It just means that we're finding ways to lower that supply. One thing I want to point out, though, before we move on, is that while tariffs and quotas have the same economic effect, there is one thing that's a little different between the two, and that is the tariff brings in revenue for the government, right? It's a tax, so it brings in tax revenue. And for that reason, we might choose the tariff over the quota. If we can equally as easily apply a tariff and a quota, then it might make sense that we impose the tariff. But here's the thing that you need to understand, as the last bullet explains. It's not a lot of money relative to the entire budget of our government. So we don't use tariffs to bring in huge amounts of money. Yeah, in absolute dollar amounts, it's large, but it's not going to represent a very large proportion of the government's budget. So yeah, it brings in some money, and that's good. Certainly more money is better than less money, but we can't necessarily build our government budget around the tariff revenue. It's just not that big. All right, back to the idea of protectionism. So now let's assume our trade barriers are in place. We've just imposed either a tariff or a quota. They work a little differently, but remember we said they have the same economic effects of reducing supply and increasing price. So we've now created a situation where the foreign product is more expensive than it would have been if we had not imposed these protectionist policies. So protectionism makes the foreign product that we're importing more expensive. Let's ask the question, who benefits from this? Who benefits from this? Well, clearly domestic producers benefit from this, right? We're keeping out some of the competition, and we're making the thing they're competing with more expensive, right? Now think about what's going to happen. When the foreign product becomes more expensive, people substitute towards the domestic good, right? And therefore, we're going to have more domestic consumption. So let's make sure you see what's happening here. We've imposed our trade barriers. Once we do it, the foreign product is now more expensive, and we've just said that domestic producers who are competing with the foreign product, they are better off because now they're competing with a product that has a higher price tag. It also means that consumers are going to substitute towards the domestic good. And so these domestic producers are going to sell more. All right, so make sure that makes sense to you. But just to confirm, let's look at an example. Let's say we tax imported Hondas. Remember what that means? Then the Hondas are going to get more expensive. And that means that some people are going to substitute to the Ford and to the Chevrolet, meaning that our domestic automobile producers are going to benefit. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is going to substitute. Most people who want a Honda may still buy the Honda, but there will be at the margin this substitution effect, and that benefits Ford and it benefits Chevrolet, of course, at the expense of Honda. But trade barriers hurt other producers, and that's the thing we need to remember. I found a great example related to Bangladesh sleeping bags, if you can imagine. And you might be thinking, what in the world? Well, remember, there are import tariffs and quotas on all kinds of things, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But this example is from Bangladesh, the sleeping bag market. Now, historically, Bangladesh had no tariffs. They enjoyed a no tariff status on their sleeping bags. So that meant they could send us as many sleeping bags as they wanted without the tax. And therefore, they sold a lot of sleeping bags to companies like Walmart. You can go to Walmart and get a sleeping bag, and at least historically, likely that could have come from Bangladesh. Now, if our government decides to use protectionism to keep out some of these Bangladeshi sleeping bags, we would impose a tax on those imported sleeping bags, right? That's called protectionism. We impose the tax, and then they get more expensive, right? So now those sleeping bags from Bangladesh cost more than they did before, which means less are sold. And that's going to hurt those producers in Bangladesh. So you see what's happening. There are going to be losers here that when we impose protectionist policies, they will be hurt. Let's recap before we continue. We've said that free trade is good for an economy, right? But there will be winners and there will be losers. Luckily, the winners generally outweigh the losers. And that's why we are saying that free trade is good. That's why we have it. The domestic industries would rather have protectionism because that shields them from competition. They would see less competition. We're going to discuss sugar. A lot of sugar comes from Costa Rica and other parts of Central America. So that is a sugar producing region. Now, the U.S. grows sugar too, and that's important to remember as we discuss this. Sugar comes from sugar farmers who are growing sugar cane and sugar beet. So we have two different forms of sugar that we grow. The problem is we are simply not competitive. And the reason is that our costs are too high. We cannot compete in sugar because our cost of production are just too high. We can't compete with the other countries' prices. Remember that their inputs cost less and labor costs less. So we are far outcompeted when it comes to sugar. In a free market for sugar, is anyone buying U.S. sugar, right? If sugar can come from just any country, you can import as much as you want from wherever you want. Is anyone buying U.S. sugar? Well, the answer is no. Why would anyone pay the higher prices when cheaper alternatives exist? For example, Dominican Republic produces a lot of sugar and it's going to be cheaper. So what's going to happen if we have a free market for sugar? If we have free trade, our farmers go out of business, right? Well, that's the idea of creative destruction. So we've talked about this. Well, we have to decide as a country, do we let this happen? And sometimes we say yes, and sometimes we say no. And of course, if the answer is no, then we implement protection policies. So do we let this happen? They go out of business, or do we protect them using protectionism? Things like quotas and tariffs, which are going to make the foreign sugar higher in price than it was before. Let's talk about who wins if we have free trade in sugar. So we import cheap Central American sugar, and that means sugar that's coming into our country costs less. And if you want to use sugar or buy sugar, it costs less than before. That means things that are made with sugar now cost less, right? If you're thinking about candy, sugar's a huge ingredient in candy it's a large proportion of the price. So now those things cost less. It's easy to see who wins under this scenario of free trade in sugar, but it's also easy to see who loses. The first winner is consumers of sugar, right? Maybe you want to go out and buy a bag of sugar. Well, when you buy a bag of sugar at Walmart, it's going to be cheaper if we have free trade in sugar because you're not going to be buying American sugar. You're going to be buying Dominican Republic sugar or sugar that comes from other places like Costa Rica. The second group that wins is consumers of products using sugar, right? Anything made with sugar will now also be cheaper because one of the central ingredients costs less. The third group that wins is firms using sugar in the production process, right? Firms that are using sugar in the production process. So if you're a candy producer, you are going to win because one of your key inputs is less expensive. Keep in mind, for all of these entities, they can buy cheaper sugar from places like Costa Rica or Dominican Republic than before if we had a trade barrier. So free trade is going to benefit consumers. That again is you buying a bag of sugar, you buying cakes and cookies, and people like candy producers. They're all going to win. But as we said, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. So let's take a look at the losers. Of course, we understand who the big loser is with free trade. That's going to be the farmers who can't sell their sugar because now there's this cheaper sugar coming in from Central America. And so they are going to be the big losers when we have free trade. Again, why? It's because their price is too high to compete with the foreign sugar. And no one's going to buy their sugar when there's a cheaper alternative. So who are we talking about again? We're talking about those sugar cane and those sugar beet farmers. And if we're going to have free trade in sugar, then these farmers are not going to be successful in the sugar industry, and they're going to have to transition to something else. Again, the idea of creative destruction. What if we decided we wanted to put an end to free trade in sugar, and instead we will protect sugar using a quota or a tariffs? And by the way, guys, we actually do this. We do have quotas and a form of combination of quotas and tariffs, but we have chosen to protect our sugar industry. Again, both are going to have the same effect, the quota and the tariff. They work a little differently. Remember, tariffs generate a little bit of revenue for the government because it's a tax, but they have the same effect. They're both going to make foreign sugar more expensive. So when we implement protectionist policies for sugar, now the Central American sugar has become more expensive, and there will be less of it. Remember, the economic effect of the quota and the tariff decreases supply, so there's less of it. Price goes up. So foreign sugar becomes more expensive, and there's a bit less of it. Let's go back to the winners. Who wins now under protectionism? So once we decide we're going to protect the domestic sugar industry, who wins? Well, of course, the winner is the American sugar farmers. Think about why the American sugar farmers, the domestic sugar farmers, are winning. They see less competition in sugar. And once foreign sugar gets more expensive, people are going to substitute towards their sugar. So who wins under protectionism? The domestic producer, right? They're being shielded from some of the competition. So again, this is the sugar cane and the sugar beet farmers. Now remember, they were the losers under free trade. They become the winners under protectionism, right? Because that's what protectionism is. We are protecting domestic producers. So that's what's happening here. The American sugar farmers are being protected and they win. But there will be losers under protectionism. So let's think about who loses. Well, consumers of sugar. Also, consumers of sugar-related products. So when we buy sugar, we lose. When we buy sugar-related products, anything made with sugar, we lose. And if you're a firm who needs to buy sugar, to use sugar in their production process, well, you also lose. Remember, these were the same entities that won under free trade when sugar was cheaper. Now we have protectionism, sugar is more expensive, and they lose. Sugar prices are going to be higher now. Because think about what has happened. Foreign sugar is more expensive, and now you have to rely on the higher domestic sugar. So how does this affect us? You and I buying a bag of sugar, you and I buying cakes and cookies, or producers that need sugar like candy producers. So do you see what just happened? When we looked at free trade, we had winners and losers. Then when we moved to protectionism, they flip-flopped, right? The winners became the losers became the winners. But there's one other loser that we need to remember, and that is foreign suppliers of sugar. When we have protectionism, we shut out some of the foreign sugar. So if Dominican Republic is a big producer of sugar, they cannot send us as much sugar now. That's going to be bad for them. That's bad for their economy. So good for domestic producers in the U.S. for this example, but bad for the foreign firms. Let's look at breakfast cereal as an example of what we've just been talking about. Studies suggest that about 32% of the cost of cereal comes from sugar, and that's pretty scary, right? When sugar prices increase, that's going to be bad for cereal producers, right? They now have to buy more expensive sugar. And some of this is going to be passed on to you and me. Now, how are the producers going to pass this cost on to you and me? Well, they're going to do it in the form of higher prices. So, when we have trade barriers and sugar gets more expensive, then the firms making cereal, they have to pay more for sugar, but then you and I also have to pay more for those products, so we lose. So to test our understanding, let's answer this question. Does the U.S. cereal industry want sugar to be protected, or do they want free trade in sugar? So think about that for a second. Which is better for the U.S. cereal industry? Well, hopefully you're thinking that they want free trade in sugar. The cereal industry wants anything that's an input to their production. Could be wheat, sugar. They want those things coming in under free trade because then they can buy them for cheaper. But let's ask another question. Does the U.S. cereal industry want cereal to be protected, or do they want free trade? So before we were talking about the sugar, which is an input, but now we're talking about cereal, the product. Well, hopefully your understanding here is that the U.S. cereal industry wants cereal to have protectionism, right? They want the industry to be protected. They don't want a whole lot of foreign-made cereal coming into the United States to compete with them. So the U.S. cereal industry wants to get their sugar under free trade because that's when it's cheaper. But they want the cereal industry to have protectionism because that means foreign cereal won't be as plentiful, it'll be higher in price, and they will sell more cereal domestically, the U.S. cereal producers. So make sure if I'm asking questions on a quiz that you're reading them carefully and trying to decide, wait, are we talking about the product or are we talking about an input to production? Our government is choosing to protect sugar, and most people don't know this is happening, and I'm guessing you didn't know it's happening. But by protecting sugar, our government creates what we call an invisible tax. So think about it. It is invisible because people don't really realize it's there. And we call it a tax. It's not a tax like a sales tax or a property tax, but it's a tax in the sense that we pay more for sugar and for cake and for candy and anything that uses sugar. So our government has created an invisible tax, and we don't generally realize it, but we're paying it in all kinds of different ways. So if we add up this invisible tax across not just sugar, but all kinds of different things that are being protected, where we now have artificially higher prices, but on a per person basis, it's very small. So the total cost of the protectionist policies on you and me consumers adds up to billions, but on a per person basis, it's not huge. And that's why we're not storming the White House in protest saying, look, you are costing us a whole lot of money. So billions of dollars is a lot, per person, not a lot. So we're back to the idea of winners versus losers. Hopefully you understand that free trade had winners and losers, and protectionism has winners and losers. And there are costs and there are benefits. Hopefully you can appreciate why I'm saying that the costs get spread across everyone. Think about it. Every single person probably consumes sugar. Well, maybe there's a few people that don't, but most people are buying sugar. We all are consuming sugar or sugar-related products, unless you just can't have sugar. But sugar is in so many different products. But the benefits from protectionism go to just a few. Remember, who benefits from the protectionism in sugar? Well, it's the sugar cane and sugar beet farmers. And that's less than 1%, far less than 1% of all of the farmers in the USA. So think about it. Costs are imposed really widely across everyone who's buying sugar and sugar-related products and all firms that use sugar, but the benefits are very concentrated, very narrowly defined, just those sugar, cane, and beet farmers. There's also an unintended consequence here. With protectionism, remember what we've done. We've made foreign sugar more expensive, and that increases the demand for domestic sugar. But here's the thing. When we increase the demand for American sugar, it makes American sugar more expensive, right? When more consumers are having to buy American, it increases the price of American sugar. So now American sugar is even more expensive. So now companies like Coca-Cola, they don't want to pay these higher prices. Coca-Cola uses a lot of sugar in their products, and I'm talking about all soft drink companies, but I'll use Coca-Cola just as an example. They don't want to pay for sugar. It's expensive. Coca-Cola used to be made with sugar, but now they've made a substitute. So let's think about it. What has Coca-Cola substituted towards instead of sugar? Well, they've moved to corn sweetener, and that's a close substitute for sugar. Corn sweetener has won. They are an unintended big winner, right? Our trade policies were not in place to help corn sweetener, and that's why I'm calling it an unintended consequence, that we're really trying to protect sugar, but in doing so, we've created a big winner, and that's corn sweetener. So if you pay attention to TV, you start seeing these ads where there seems to be this war between sugar and corn sweetener, and you're like, what is this about? Well, this is what it's about. Our protectionist policies has created a big win for corn sweetener, and it's created more competition between sugar and corn sweetener. Now, let's ask the question if sugar is unique, and the answer is no. If we look at the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States, which is basically a big book where all tariffs and quotas are found, you see that trade barriers are plentiful and they span many, many industries. And these are just a few examples. I pulled the document and looked through it. There were 8 pages just on relevant tariffs for pharmaceuticals, 24 pages on tariffs and trade policies for cocoa, and I mean tariffs and quotas, 36 pages for clocks and watches, 39 pages for footwear, 40 pages for iron and steel, 58 pages for cotton, and guys, this is just to name a few. This is a humongous document. Here you go. And notice what the title says. It says Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, Basic Edition. So this is the basic edition. I don't know what that means, but that implies there's some advanced edition that's even bigger than this. So, wow, this is humongous, right? That means we've got a whole lot of trade barriers in place, both tariffs and quotas, and then weird combinations of tariffs and quotas that we call tariff rate quotas. We're not going to get into that, but it gets really complicated. Now, there are a lot of justifications for protectionism. Sometimes we do see protectionism. There are times when protectionism does make sense, right? And the example from Haiti illustrates that Haiti probably should have refused to open free trade with President Clinton. They should have chosen to protect their rice industry. So there are arguments used to justify protectionism, and sometimes it does make sense. And one of them is to save jobs. And in Haiti, if they decimate the rice industry, that probably costs them a lot of jobs, and so it might not have made sense. Now, do we protect our industries to save all jobs? No. We have to believe in the idea of creative destruction. Out with the old, in with the new, and sometimes some industries downsize so that others can grow. So we don't save every single job, right? That would be nonsensical. We'd never have any free trade. But if it's going to devastate employment in your country, like Haiti and rice, yeah, you might decide you'd rather save the jobs. A second argument is what we call the infant industry argument. And this is to protect an infant industry that needs time to grow, right? Maybe you're just getting into production of a certain product, and that industry is in its infancy, right? It's a baby, and you need to protect it and let it have time to grow. Eventually, it will be able to compete globally. And then you should lift some of your trade barriers, but you do need to give it time to grow. A third argument is that you might want to keep out products that are not sustainable. For example, we have outright bans on ivory, and we might want to have limits to teak, for all I know that we do. But think about those products that are not sustainably sourced in other countries. We don't want to have an import market for those, so we're going to have trade barriers in place. A fourth one is to keep out products that don't meet our standards. For example, it might be environmental standards or related to food production. We don't want to bring in food that doesn't meet our expectations from the FDA, right? Fourth, we might use trade barriers to punish other nations when they're not being fair in the trade game. So we see this sometimes between the US and China, that we feel like China isn't being fair, so we might impose some kind of penalty on them through using trade barriers simply to punish them, to be punitive. And finally, sometimes we might claim that something is vital to national defense. Now, it might be hard to argue that sugar is vital to national defense, but you get the idea. There might be times when we argue that we have to protect something because we cannot risk being without. Let's look at some real-world examples. Well, these are going to be a little bit old because I pulled them for some other lecture I was doing. But in 2005, we imposed tariffs on Asian shrimp. Now, why would we do that? Well, we also have shrimp fishermen in the U.S., right? And American shrimp fishermen were having trouble competing. Well, they were still fishing by boat, but in Asia, they were shrimp farming, and that has become very common. So our farmers were unable to compete when they are still operating by boat in the water, and Asian shrimp farmers are basically farming. So we decided to protect our fishermen from Asian competition in shrimp. In another example, the United States put quotas in place for Chinese textiles. So textiles, things like fabric, clothing, and this applied to cotton trousers and cotton knit shirts and underwear. And guys, the language can be very specific. If you look at that harmonized tariff schedule, I mean, they're talking about very specific. It doesn't say pants, it says specifically these kind of pants. Anyway, the problem was here is that imports from China had been on the rise, and that led to a job loss situation in our country, more than 16,000 American jobs. Because guys, we produce clothing, but we're not very competitive. So if we're going to have clothing, we're going to need to protect it. And then at one point, the European Union actually put trade barriers on us, on our American beef. Well, why would they want to keep out our American beef? Because our use of hormones was too high and it violated the European Union standards. So these are just some examples of the trade game that you do see trade barriers put in place, sometimes to protect jobs, sometimes to protect new industries, sometimes to protect your own consumers when you think the imported product doesn't meet the standards. The last thing we're going to talk about is CAFTA. CAFTA stands for the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Central American Free Trade Agreement, right? Rhymes with NAFTA. And what you see here dates back to 2005. And let's read this. It says, in a victory for President Bush's trade agreement, the House early Thursday morning voted 217 to 215, look at that, very close vote, to approve the Central American Free Trade Agreement. This agreement, which was signed by President Bush last year and approved by the Senate last month, will reduce or eliminate trade barriers between the United States, 5 Central American nations, and the Dominican Republic. So what does that mean? Free trade opened up in Central America for those countries participating and involving the United States back in 2005, meaning that that's going to be an opportunity for these economies to transform. Now, you're going to learn more about CAFTA outside of this particular lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions about this lecture. I know we've covered a lot of content, so please make sure you review it carefully before you move on to any assessments. I thank you for listening, and I hope you have a fantastic day.